Disaster relief has become a sticking point in the bipartisan negotiations as we wait for the finalized text of this continuing resolution to get out the door. Lawmakers say they've agreed to deliver more than $100 billion in emergency aid. Money will go to communities impacted by the hurricanes that hit the U.S. this fall. We saw big economic impacts in the aftermath. For example, retail sales data today for November beat expectations after October's reading lost steam due to consumer disruption from these storms. Earlier, House Speaker Mike Johnson called this funding necessary to help out Americans who are still hurting.
A couple of intervening things have occurred. We had, as we say, as we describe them, acts of God. We had these massive hurricanes, as you know, in the late fall, Helene and Milton and other disasters. We have to make sure that the Americans that were devastated by these hurricanes get the relief they need. So we are adding to this a disaster relief package, and that's critically important.
President Biden had requested this emergency funding back in October. That was partly because the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA, at the time said it already spent about half of its $20 billion in allocated funding just for fiscal year 2025 alone. That's supposed to last through September 30th of next year. Now, experts warned back then that Washington needs to break this cycle. Whether or not this bill alone will do that if it's passed remains to be seen.
I went through it when I was FEMA administrator in 2017 to 19. I had to ask Congress 3 times for more funding into the disaster relief fund. And eventually it was approved. But how do we get out of this cycle? And right now, I believe it's not just the funding, but how do we get out of this response cycle? And where do we start to incentivize communities to do the right things, such as proper land use planning, implementing the stronger building codes that the ICC recommends?
Now, it's not just FEMA who says that they need this money for federal emergency response. The Small Business Administration has become absolutely critical in how the federal government responds in times of need. The SBA provides low-interest loans to help businesses and individuals, in some cases up to $2 million to rebuild after disaster. Kaylee and Mike, the SBA says it's out of funding for its loan program until this spending bill can get approved.
Well, I guess it raises the question, Tyler, of how it's out of funding already. How quickly do they go through it?
Right, exactly. So FEMA, for example, went through its fiscal year 2024 fund so quickly that Congress had to open its 2025 fund early so that it can essentially work through this backlog of cases. I mentioned that $20 billion number allocated for fiscal year 2025. FEMA says $8 billion of that didn't go to anything related to fiscal year 2025, but actually to western states dealing with those deadly wildfires from earlier this year. So, Mike and Kaylee, it's pretty easy to see that this year's bucket is going to be used up pretty quickly since FEMA's coordinating a federal response for 6 states across the Southeast that have been approved for federal assistance to help in the aftermath of Hurricanes Milton and Helene.